Thank you very much. It is like looking at my classroom after the midterm exams, the lecture right after that, everything's cleaned out. I have the job of trying to be zany up here, at least according to the conference organizers, so I'm going to do my best to comply with that. And I'll give you one short caveat, and that is that in spite of all the really adult things I think I've done in my life, inside there is still some child that is in wonder and in awe of things such as what Professor Heger showed us, and to imagine some of the devices, the wonderful devices that I've been shown in my life and hopefully helped enable. And it is that sense of wonder that I bring to you in my talk, where I try and describe why I think they won't work and why they run the risk of tremendous failure and not getting adopted into the economy, and why it's my job and the job of people like me to turn that around and to overcome an incipient, not market failure on the part of some of those devices or on the part of some of the wonderful minds that think them up, but rather a policy failure, a broad failure of the society in terms of its elected leadership or its policy direction to enable and encourage those kinds of technologies to get in and actually get used. Not showcased, not held up for how well we did, but actually used to make a penetration in the market and to actually change the way that the market works. So my talk tonight is about renewable energy. That's my icon. Mostly electricity. I tend not to work in the fuels area very much. So I'm going to talk to you about electricity and that electricity form that has its origin in renewable fuels. I'm going to stay specifically away from ethanol. I have a particular bias against the corn lobby, I suppose, and so I tend to not think of them as contributing very much to the economy, perhaps more to their own states than the broad economy. We tend to think of renewable energy in terms of technology. In fact, what you've seen today is very technology specific, and maybe even as an icon for a philosophical point of view. It's less damaging. They're more environmentally sensitive. They're a more responsible choice. Many among us may wring their hands and bemoan the fact that energy demand climbs in North America and worldwide, yet the total share of renewable energy remains hopeful but anemic. You hear, if only the public really cared, if only costs could really come down, if only we could include the full cost of carbon in the price of energy from fossil-based generation. We might even ask, but we don't, what are the full life cycle costs of our energy production, even renewables? We specifically stay away from that one. Well, the absolute contribution of renewable energy has increased. Overall diversity has improved, and we are more efficient in dispatch to the grid, and technology improvements have driven down costs. So what? My guess is, if those are the only yardsticks and goals that we had to overcome, renewable energy would still remain a bit player well into the next century. I don't want that to happen. I suspect anyone in this room who's here tonight doesn't either. The risk, however, is that good intentions notwithstanding, a continued misunderstanding of the real pressure points needed to enable change in the electric system will cause us to not only lose time, but further increase dependency on fossil-based thermal energy systems and lose further ground in bringing renewables into the system. I'm talking about that place where renewable energy resources become real, become enabled before they're installed. In the hearing rooms of legislatures and in the hearing rooms of regulators is what I have in mind. That's the collective group of actors who tend to act most nobly when faced with adversity like shortages in oil or gasoline, threats of pollution, or even worse, dire predictions of price increases. The problem is that their responses are typically narrow, often parochial, rarely comprehensive, and they don't last a long time unless they get embedded and last too long. It's not a consistent way to do business, and it's not a good way to collaborate with investors. The outcome, in any case, is likely to be inefficient at best, more likely destructive, since inaction or uncoordinated actions will tend to reinforce the role and dependencies on the fossil-fired generation that I talked about before. Why? Because it's not just about technology. In spite of what you've heard today, it's not just about doing good things. It's about having technology that works within the power grid and not only grows with demand, but displaces other energy forms that may not contribute to a long-term balanced economy and ultimately a sustainable environment, whatever that means to any of us. If we look at renewable energy resources generally, it has the right characteristics to contribute to all these goals. However, adoption and integration has been inconsistent over time. I maintain it will continue to be until we overcome three fundamental obstacles, all related to the policy arena. Since technology is an offering, it needs receivers or enablers. It needs more than just acceptance or permission, though. Renewable energy needs long-term, consistent, powerful champions. And with that in mind, I say something fundamental needs to change. And I maintain that that something is us, all of us. The people who influence, work for, or intervene with policymakers. We need to understand what policymakers don't understand. And before you start laughing at that, realize that this has to do with work that on a technical level is just out of their job description. It doesn't stop them from wading in, of course, but it does suggest that they're not working within their core competency. I think we've asked them to address and understand the wrong issues. I think it's time to get the policymakers to appreciate the right issues and let their representatives understand and implement the outcomes. What do I want them to appreciate? I want them to understand the difference between markets and technology. I want them to understand the difference between engineered systems, like the electrical grid, and the world of consumer behavior. To start with, I will paint a picture, or I hope to paint a picture for you, that describes three separate groups of actors. First, consumers. That's all of us, interacting at a number of different levels. And by all of us, I mean everyone in commerce and in government and just basic consumers. Second, we have the engineering and technology sector. They find, transform, and deliver power where it's demanded. And finally, we have policy and regulatory institutions, the rule makers. I'm tempted to say the deciders, but I'm afraid that you might think I was commenting on someone currently in office. Even in Canada, we do get the NY Times on the internet. There is a common thread that ties all of these actors, but not all at the same scale. They all have a sense of time, and in the progression that I just drew, it should get longer or go further into the future as we move from consumer to producer to regulator. That's a major element of what economists think of as the discount rate, measuring the value of an investment made today into the future. With energy, consumers place a high value on having energy on demand and in quantities that satisfy their needs. There's not much thought given to having enough to take them into the future. They leave that for the other two groups. The second group does that pretty well, at least they can conceive of it well. It is a business after all. I mean, what investment, configured or constrained by designs or limits, will satisfy what expected load in the future? Assuming location and fuel supply, and environmental considerations that can be met, this becomes a solvable equation. My analogy, however, breaks down in the third group, where time, money, price, supply, and long-term environmental quality get confused. Confused in rhetoric, surely, but more fundamentally, confused in the sense that of how markets for energy really work. Even more important for my discussion, how the markets for renewable energy work, or should work in the future. The consequence is that policymakers misunderstand three basic elements of the market. Change that misunderstanding, I believe, and we can change everything. We can change the political will, and over time, we can create more than a niche for just a broad portfolio of renewable energy choices. What do you think it is that they don't understand? In my opinion, they fundamentally miss the point about the role of capital. You can't just order capital around. Capital markets, like rules, even draconian ones, capital markets, like rules, even draconian ones, as long as they're consistent. The power system is capital intensive to a fault, and between a good idea and throwing the switch, change can be glacial. Second, you can't just dictate winners. Look at Tom Friedman's example of the herd in finance. They go where they expect to find rewards and only serendipitously where you tell them to go. Remember the old banker's adage, you can't push on a string. You can't just push technology out into the market and expect it will get adopted. And they fundamentally don't understand that time matters. They don't get their discounts right, and until they do, they might go on and get reelected for some of the policies that they enforce or champion, but those policies won't take them into the future, certainly not forever. Fail to change any of these or all of these, and we'll ensure that, at best, modest representation and use of renewables occurs in the market. Let me make that point by reminding all of us that energy in all its forms is not optional. No society can exist without it. I think that means a new definition of the role of regulators and policymakers is what's needed if we're actually going to see some of these technologies emerge into the market. We need goals, but goals without rules don't work. Just look at voluntary compliance models for emissions in Canada if you think I'm kidding. We need a new standard of time. That standard has to give policymakers the gift and the comfort of decisions based on results beyond their term of office. And I'm dead serious about this. If we fail to come up with something that rewards people for making a decision that is beyond their current term of office, no matter how glittery, no matter how much that technology or that technique appeals to the child in me, it will fail. I don't care how cheap it is. I don't care how novel it is. It will fail. We need to give people who are in office or in a policy-making role the incentive to overcome their own natural limits on time in office. Regulators, I think, can be the bridge to get there. They're the enablers. They're the people whose terms should transcend that of the policymakers and who should make good rule-based regulations that can be implemented by industry. We need a new understanding of how markets really work, or they don't. We need a price policy that discards the adage that cheaper is always better. Wrong model, wrong signal, and ultimately very destructive. We need to bring the political will to a greater understanding of how markets really work and why they need consistent, long-term goals and rules. We need built-in forgiveness for policymakers who dare to reach beyond popular time frames or their own term of office. And for economists, if there are any others in the room, we need to abandon one of our most hallowed concepts, that of the beneficent, invisible hand. Markets for energy don't self-regulate. To paraphrase Joseph Stiglitz, who has good and wonderful company here tonight, the reason the invisible hand is invisible is that it doesn't exist. Thank you very much.
Must congratulate Gary to the pronunciation of my name. I have so many pronunciations, you can't believe it. Actually, one of the more memorable ones, which I told Catherine, was when I was on a sabbatical to Cornell University, and the janitor said, "Where is that big Swedish guy? Benji." But 5 years later, I was baptized in Japan because I made a business card in Japanese. I was told I had to have that, and that called me bento. You know what bento means? Okay. A little lunchbox. So actually, by Professor Aisawa, president of Tokyo Institute of Technology, has baptized me to bento-san. That's not the topic of tonight. I've actually added in a subtitle after correspondence with Leslie and later on with Catherine. And we were jumping back and forth between nanotechnology for sustainable energy and something about the Swedish energy system. And I will, of course, do both. So the first thing is a little about Swedish energy policy and activities at the academies of science and Academy of Engineering, and then on nanotechnology. But first, this lesson. I love to talk to taxi drivers and to haircutters here in the US about where Sweden is, and I continuously learn that Sweden makes watches and Switzerland makes cars. So, on this picture, Sweden is up here, we are here, we are at the latitude of Alaska, and you are at the latitude of Northern Africa. Why is it livable at all? It's because we have the Gulf Stream coming up with warm water here. You have cold water from north coming down here. On the right here, we have, actually, I'm from Gothenburg, here is Stockholm, here is Helsinki, here is Oslo, here is Copenhagen. That is Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. Now, some important facts about Sweden. We are 9 million people along 2,000 kilometers. We have a gasoline price of about $6 per gallon, and we still drive cars. Most people live down here in the southern part. In the northern part, we have many rivers, some of which are untouched and which supply a lot of hydroelectric power to Sweden. Essentially, the whole country is covered by forest, if it's not lakes. And we have actually quite a lot of unexploited hydropower, but we try to preserve these for recreation and so on. Now, the Swedish energy policy is based on a three-party agreement. They are not agreeing on everything on the left and the right-hand side, but it is fairly good consensus. And it is the security of supply, competitiveness of the industry, the climate, and phasing out of nuclear. Sweden is actually a major nuclear power nation. As we can see from this slide showing the total energy supply, and the most, I think, striking feature of this graph is the declining oil and the increasing nuclear power. It's really the nuclear, while hydroelectric has stayed basically constant. If we move to electricity production, we still see that it's the nuclear power that has made a difference. Hydropower has been roughly constant and stays for about half of the production today. This development has led to a very interesting change. For example, in district heating for houses, we have basically gone out of oil and replaced that by biofuels, peat, and so on. And the big difference is in oil products. The change in the import of oil is also dramatic, mainly now from the North Sea. So, summarizing this, what has happened over the last 25, 30 years is that we have drastically reduced the dependence on oil, and it's mainly today for transportation, and nuclear has increased. And still we have had a referendum saying we're not going to build more nuclear power, which is different than, for example, in our neighbor Finland, who is actually expanding nuclear power. This has also led to the CO2 emissions have gone down in absolute numbers since the 80s and stayed fairly constant, even decreasing here. How did we get there? Well, fossil-free electricity production, energy-efficient industry, high thermal standards in building, a lot of insulation, also heat pumps, and CO2 taxes and other policy incentives. However, I must say, as a personal comment to this list, that we are extremely fortunate to have these natural resources, the biomass, the hydroelectric, and not being very many people. So, just before I went here, the government's Commission on Oil, which is an initiative to further reduce the dependence on oil, came out with a new set goals, and these goals are to achieve at least 20% increase in the efficiency of energy use. We've heard today that that's more than possible. No oil for residence and building heating, essentially no oil for that purpose. And even a 40 to 50% less use of gasoline and diesel, and less use of oil in industry. So these are the set goals for the next 20 years or 15 years. It's, I think it's a realistic goal. For example, in housing, the predictions are, and they are really realistic, that the best new buildings that are on the way will have almost 1/3 of the energy consumption that we have today. Academy programs. These are programs by the Royal Academy of Science. This is the academy awarding the Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry, and the Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences. Both academies have dedicated energy committees. I have the pleasure of sitting in both of them. And the academy programs actually have a very significant, not to say strong in some cases, influence on the development and implementation of the energy strategies. It's easy to trace back. So in some way, the politicians and planners listen to what we are saying. The chairman of the Academy of Science, Royal Swedish Academy of Science Committee, is a nuclear physicist from the beginning. Sven Kullander. He makes marvelous work. And here is the hall where the decisions about Nobel Prizes are taken. Walter, maybe you've been there. I'm sure. It's not a nice place to be, yes. The Energy Committee was started very recently by the president of the, at that time and today, president of the Academy, Gunnar Ökvist. And he appointed 3 committees, one on health and basically on health, one on research policy, and one on energy. And the main purpose is to evaluate and assess energy issues, but also dissemination of results to a broad spectrum of society, and I will return to this one. There are 10 members, one from each class, and a class is like physics, chemistry, economy, and so on and so forth. Here are some ongoing projects. I will talk a little about the book on energy. Biomass is there, hydropower is there, solar energy is there, even from Africa, fusion is there. Energy from the transport sector is a major challenge. The Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences is to its character, very different. It's a very strong representation from industry, people, from economics. It's a much more mixed, but the 2 academies also complement each other and work together in a number of areas. I will just mention the environmental foresight, the science and everyday life and energy, where I'm chairing Power Circle. The reason for this science and everyday life is actually that we believe that in order to get an impact, we also have to have a bottom-up process where people really demand on politicians to meet the demands Michael Moore was mentioning, to really make the politicians want to come with proposals that extend more than their mandate period. So, a simple book on energy is a project we took a decision about 2 years ago. The basic target for this was to reach decision makers, society planners, general public, and students. Write a book at the pre-university level that was not totally diluted because all of the different opinions. And how do you do that? You can do that by problematize the issue and first give facts, colored by objectivity, raise some central questions. And rather than diluting these answers and make them lukewarm, give very distinct answers, but very different ones, as even opposing answers, hopefully generating a discussion, and also consider the short and long term. This book, which is just close to the printing stage, and we don't know if this will be a total failure or a success. This book will look something like this. This is in Swedish, but I will tell you what it is. This is the morning with the family Ericsson. What is our dependence on energy? The challenge, and it is, I promise you it's a real challenge, to make a book that Academy members, like the Nobel Prize Committee for Physics and Chemistry, that they approve of. That's not so difficult. But that they approve of it and the target groups will read it and like it. That's the big challenge. And that has been a battle going on for over a year. So if my daughter is one of the proofreaders, and she just about likes it, she's going into science journalism. It looks like this. We give facts. We give some cartoons. We have a fantastic illustrator, tell her what hydroelectric energy is, where the energy comes from that you eat, and so on. Very simple things. And we also have a global perspective. Will we succeed? Well, we will know in May if we succeed. I would be happy to send you one, however, it is in Swedish. Now, the summary on this part of my talk is that our dependence on oil has been reduced very significantly, and we're continuing that work. Climate is in focus. Biomass will be rising. And the issue of nuclear is a very interesting one. That discussion, I would say that the general public in Sweden is today more positive to nuclear than they were when the referendum was. But it's an oscillating position. I was voting against nuclear. I'm not so sure anymore. Okay, let's move into some more futuristic, nanoscience and nanotechnology for energy technology. What can they contribute? This is a safe thing because it will take many years before whatever I say now is implemented. Well, it's not quite through. There are things that come. But someone said, if you don't look back, you cannot look forward, and then you have to look up. So what has been the driving force for nanotechnology? It's really Moore's law. I guess you, as I did, read the New York Times about a week ago or so when Intel was launching the 45 nanometer transistor. This just goes on. And in the wake of this development, we have got a fantastic set of tools to make things small. And this is really what nanotechnology is about. The miniaturization toolboxes from microelectronics combined with the push from Moore's law have created many spin-off effects. I should acknowledge that there are parallel developments in chemistry, self-organizing systems, and so on. But this drive has really been the most important one, in my view, for nanotechnology. In my group, we're doing a lot of work in this area, but some years ago, we also started to look into nanotechnology for sustainable energy, and I was fortunate to get a special grant from our president, building up a platform for nanotechnology for energy at our university. This is going on just now. And What are the potential areas? If you think about it, you will find probably twice as many headings as I have here. But some of them are in photovoltaics, and I have saved time, or actually Alan Heger has saved time for me. I will be quicker than I thought. Hydrogen production and storage, I can also be very quick on. Gasification of coal and biomass, even if it's not sustainable in the century perspectives, or many century perspectives, it's an important challenge for nanotechnology to contribute to this area. Solar thermal, catalysis for cleaning combustion, and not the least for energy efficiency. For example, in industrial processes, fuel cells, thermoelectrics, a way to better use or exploit temperature gradient. CO2 fixation, and sensors for energy efficiency and clean emissions. We've learned that there is plenty of room for energy efficiency improvements, and in many of those, improved sensors could contribute to that. One of my students looked into nano publications, searching it according to certain keywords, and he found that this, and we have actually data showing that this is just rocketing. Of course, this has to do with funding for nanotechnology worldwide, but it's an interesting development. Nanotechnology and solar energy. Alan Heger has, as I said, already covered this, but what this very much is about is to take solar energy, creating electron-hole pairs. And these electron-hole pairs do some kind of a job. One kind of a job is just to harvest the electrons and drive a current. That's a photovoltaic solar cell. This happens to be the so-called Grätzel cell, but the principle is essentially the same in the polymer solar cell or in the silicon solar cell. Or you may want to create hydrogen. Then you use this hot electron that is excited by light to drive a redox reaction, which creates oxygen and hydrogen out of the water molecule. Or you may want to mimic biology. You may want to do what is done in photosynthesis, but manipulate it a little so that hydrogen is released as it already occurs from some bacteria. But you want to increase that percentage. So photovoltaics is, there is a lot of approaches. Crystalline silicon, which unfortunately is expensive. I think the payback time for reducing silicon oxide to silicon is something like 3 to 4 years. Amorphous silicon, a little better, thin film. We have heard about all of these. I wanted to put up this Eric McFarland, since he comes from Santa Barbara, and he has one concept that is maybe not so close as the other ones, but it's an interesting idea. I'm having dinner with him tomorrow night to see how far he has come. Plasmonic nanoparticles. I had to give a little physics here, and I will come to that at the end. Crystalline silicon, I will skip that altogether. The dye-sensitized Grätzel cell is already shown. It's basically an electrolytic cell. An electron is taken from the ground state in a dye molecule in exactly the same way that Alan Heger described, and it goes into the conduction band of titanium. This cell is composed of nanoparticles of very varying sizes. So what we try to do is to really scrutinize this structure. What is a good structure? What is a less good structure? And here is a picture from one of my students. And what he uses is, in addition to the dye molecules, which are the purple ones, he uses gold particles that are elongated. Such particles have so-called plasma resonances, that when light shines on these particles, the electrons get into oscillations, and this capture of photons becomes more efficient than it were without the gold particles. So it's kind of an antenna. And he has shown that by shining light with different polarization vectors, that the photocurrent across here depends on the polarization, which is proof that these gold particles act as antennas. I will come back to that a little later. Hydrogen production, it has also already been covered. I will just say that the process is more or less the same, except that this electron is used in a different way at the counter electrode to produce hydrogen. And if you produce hydrogen or water, you have to produce oxygen. Now, there is great hope that biology will do this work for us. That is, that microorganisms, bacteria or algae. And I just want to make one point here. That is that where this happens is in a biomembrane, the same type of membrane that surrounds your cells in your body. And what I've discovered, to my surprise, was that the project we started 10 years ago to look at lipid membranes, biomembranes, solely for the purpose of building biosensors, gives very interesting spin-off effects into the energy area. Why is that so? It is because these lipid membranes, composed of two molecules that are oriented opposite to each other, form a fantastic 5 nanometer thick membrane in which you can incorporate a number of things. And for example, you can separate electrons and holes, as Ellen Higger talked about. If they are excited here, the electrons and holes go in different directions and so on. So I expect actually very interesting synergies between the molecular biology, the cell biology work that is going on today to build templates for stem cell cultivation, for biosensors, for drug targeting. I see very strong spin-off effects from that type of research into the energy area. Example from the development of catalytic vehicle emission, we have had that topic also covered, so that saves me some time. This is really one of the success stories, the clean air, essentially clean air that comes out of cars. Close by here in Los Angeles, the smog problem was solved by this technology. And what is it? It's a so-called monolith covered by 1 to 10 nanometer platinum, rhodium, and other particles. It's a very complex structure to analyze. Nanotechnology has provided us with a fantastic tool to mimic this and scrutinize the function of this in a systematic manner, which is done today by many groups. And then we can use the feedback from such studies to improve this catalyst. Here are some examples. I will not bore you with them. You need all the fabrication tools of nanoelectronics to do it. And after you have done that, you can work in this loop of nanofabricate model catalyst, use all the transmission electron microscopes, scanning probe microscopes, and so on. Investigate the catalytic properties and work in this loop. And interestingly, exactly the same approach can be done to improve fuel cell electrodes, to improve industrial catalysts, and so forth. So, some final physics lecture. Light excites oscillations in the electron gas. When light impinges on nanoparticles of gold and silver, we get different colors depending on size. This is why old medieval church windows have different colors. Or if you go to Cambridge King's College and see these beautiful colors, the blue ones are small particles, the red ones are big particles. The range is 10, 20 nanometer up to maybe a couple of 100 nanometer. Why is that so? I'm actually quite puzzled. Maybe Walter can help me, but why is that so? Because we learned that plasmons, so-called plasmons, electron gas oscillations, have unique energies that you read in the textbook in solid-state physics. But this doesn't fit at all. You change the resonance frequency. Actually, I think the answer is quite simple, but correct me if I'm wrong. It is that these plasmons have a broad spectrum. So if you trap them into a cavity, there is a resonance cavity, and the size defines exactly where the resonance will be. So if you have a small cavity, you get a high frequency. If you have a broad cavity, you get a low frequency. But the interesting thing with this is that you can tune the response of light with the shape and size. Interestingly, if you make an elongated particle, it's blue in the short direction and it's red in the long direction. So you can, by changing polarization, you change the light. But the color, the question is, can this be used for solar energy collection? And this is what we're trying. I don't claim that we can, but I think there is an opportunity. Here are some samples done by a student of mine. Here are the colors you see. You can read these as absorption spectra, from blue here for small particles, 30 nanometer, to very red, outside what you can see with your eye, for 200 nanometer particles. You can tune the response over the whole spectrum. Now comes the interesting thing. Most of the so-called plasmonic world has been dealing with silver and gold. Actually, if you read your textbook in solid-state physics, this should happen for any metal. And as far as we have seen, it does happen for any metal, even for aluminum. Here is an example from silver, platinum, palladium. They all work. And the interesting thing here is that it takes us back to creation of electrons, hot electrons, as Alan Higger talked about and as I talked about. A plasmon, when it decays, can either emit light again, or it can create an electron. And what we can tune with the choice of material and shape is actually how much goes into electrons. I'm not going to tell you about this, but actually platinum and palladium are much more efficient in converting these plasmons into electron-hole pairs than silver is. So this boils down to towards the end of my talk. What we want to do is to use nanoparticles that act as antennas, create electron-hole pairs that do some work. We're using this for chemical sensing, biosensing. That's not so interesting for energy, but for water splitting, for photocatalysis, and for solar cells. So we have a project with Michael Gretzel to try to improve the efficiency of the Gretzel cell in this way. Timescales for this nanotechnology, as I said, we are in nanotechnology, we're basically down here. We're not on the S-curve that is needed to penetrate society into something really impactable. And the time scale here is, as we know with almost any technology, 25 to 30 years. Maybe we have passed 10 of those years, or even less. But I think, as a conclusion on this part of my talk, that nanotechnology has a very strong potential to contribute to a future energy system. And these are the ones I mentioned in the beginning, so I will not repeat them again. In view of time, I will just leave it like that, and I want to thank you very much.
What I'd like to do is ask the three panel members, they've been introduced very briefly. You'll find out more about them in the back of your program, to take 3 or 4 minutes each and make whatever remarks they want to about the previous papers, or if they're opinionated, express brief opinions. Let's start at the far end.
Thank you, Walter. I want all of you to know that remained here. Mr. Hansen said you'll get a $100 bill when you leave. It's obvious sitting through this sessions today that there's difference of opinion. That's very healthy. That's the way the world goes around. I must say that I disagreed with some of them, but that's how we learn and that's how we move forward. I'm with Titan Oil Recovery. We use microbial enhanced oil recovery to recover oil from oil fields using microbes. Now, our company totally supports the movement for renewable energy sources. We feel that that is a must be done. It must be started today. In the meantime, hopefully the world would use our process to recover oil that's trapped in oil fields. Let me leave you with 4 things I think that are important that you should know what's going on in the oil world. Today, 80% of the oil fields in the world, which is probably around 1 million, are currently experiencing depletion. That means they're producing less oil. Approximately 65% of the oil that's found in place originally cannot be recovered using today's processes and methods. This represents 6.2 trillion barrels of oil. I'll repeat that, 6.2 trillion barrels of oil. If 10% of that oil could be recovered, that means 620 billion barrels of oil. You heard previously today, 31 billion barrels are used each year globally. This would represent 20 more years of oil at today's usage rate. Most of the experts today agree that oil production can no longer keep up with oil usage. Some refer to this as peak oil. This is a very controversial subject in the oil industry. After spending 2 years researching and reading literally hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of information, I have come out and believe that peak oil is a real situation and a real challenge to the world. 2 weeks ago, Matthew Simmons gave a talk here at UCSB, and he made that statement. He believes that peak oil is a reality.
Okay.
One last thing, please. Over the years, oil has been so cheap that all of the nations of the world have built their economies based upon cheap oil. Cheap oil is no longer available. You can look forward to the consequences of the rich countries controlling the oil, and the poor countries that do not have oil will have to find an answer, and I don't know what that answer is. Thank you, Walter.
Well, I wanted to comment on the diversity of opinions we've heard. I think that shows two things. It shows, one, that the conference is doing a good job of presenting all views, that it isn't tilted one direction or another. It also shows that there's not just one answer. I think it's going to have to be a portfolio of all these things we've heard, because there is no silver bullet out there. There's nothing that's going to cure all of our problems with just one technology. In looking across the past presentations, the last set, there are some commonalities there. I can see in looking at Mark Jones's presentation from Dow on some of the things that can be done for creating other sources of carbon and hydrogen to make new products. And I did see some discussion there on biomass costs, and there was an item on the chart that I don't think I'd mentioned, but it was interesting that it showed that algae seemed to have a better yield than most of the other biomasses, and I think there's probably some potential out there to use some things that are not traditional sources of biomass. Looking on the work on the low-cost plastic solar cells, I think there are probably a dozen different types of solar cells being made out there, from silicon, from amorphous silicon, and various thin films, and I think we need to keep working on all of those to find the ones that work in the particular applications. Some of the work that's going on to make either plastic cells or thin film cells that you could integrate into building panels, for example, that make it just part of your standard process. So when you go forward to build a house, that house has not only the capability to keep the rain off your head, but to make electricity in the process. So I think more work on that is a good thing. I've been on task forces with Joan before and have seen the debate on hydrogen versus electric vehicles, and that seems to be the challenge. I'm on another panel next week on electric vehicles and plug hybrids and hydrogen vehicles, so there's a real debate going on there, and I didn't see anybody coming to blows in this one, but I've seen some pretty heated discussions in the past. I recently rode in a fuel cell vehicle, and it's an amazing vehicle. I just have the same concern, though, about the infrastructure and how long it's going to take to really get the refueling centers out there. In Professor Moore's discussion, I understand all of his points. I think California is probably ahead of policymakers on most of those issues. I think if you look at the policy that California has had in place for the last 30 years on energy efficiency, in the last 5 or 6 years on renewables, you'll see that we're probably ahead of most of the rest of the country. And I was impressed by the nanotechnology, and I see where some of these things can come together with some of the other discussions. For example, on the earlier discussion on Dow and where there's different types of gasification, I think some of the nanoparticles can be used in some of those catalysts to create methane from syngas and some other things there. So I do see some real connectivity between these technologies also.
Okay. I'll try to synthesize what I heard today through the lens of a venture capitalist. That's what we do for a living in our shop. And this area, which within the venture capital world has come to be known as clean tech, has experienced incredible growth, as have many of the technology areas that were discussed over the past 5 or 10 years, whereas it's now the third largest area of venture capital investment on the venture capital pie chart behind information technology and life sciences. And Santa Barbara is home to one of the leading firms in this area, also NGen Partners, and my colleague Rob Koch is here from NGen. So you have some very strong homegrown talent here in that regard. But for venture capitalists, we are looking at and investing in all the things that were discussed here today. Where the dollars are going, the biggest category for venture investing in this general area is in the solar area. Why is that? Well, solar for the past about 10 years has been growing at approximately 35% compound annual growth rate. There are various generations of technology that are available for investment. The current Gen 1 or flat panel technology is relatively mature, but the balance of systems, which is half the cost of an installed solar system, still holds out a lot of opportunity for cost savings with better and cheaper inverters, better, cheaper mounting systems, et cetera. We're seeing the proliferation of what we think of as Gen 2 solar devices, and those are the thin films which were discussed. There's been a reemergence of concentrating photovoltaics, solar thermal technologies that are deployable at the utility or plant scale, and then Gen 3, which we think of as the nano-enabled materials that Professor Kasemo mentioned. The second biggest area is biofuels, and this is an interesting one within the world of venture capital because the community is really split. Some see it primarily as project finance, which is really a different type of private equity than venture capital. Some is directed towards the deeply embedded technology changes in enzyme engineering and things like that, unleashing the potential of cellulosic ethanol for geographic and feedstock differentiation. There's some difficult timelines with that for VCs, but it's an area that gets a lot of attention. Clean coal is another area. We talked about the availability of coal and also some of the environmental issues that are associated with coal. It's the opinion of our firm, and I think some others, that since coal is so abundant, and especially in North America, that we will use it, we will burn it, but the will of the people, as demonstrated through the regulatory environment and political environment, will insist that coal be burned about as cleanly as natural gas, and somehow we've got to find ways to deal with the carbon dioxide issue there. But there are pre-combustion technologies that have to do with getting moisture out of coal and raising its BTU content, and there are post-combustion technologies that are enhanced multi-pollutant control technologies, carbon capture, all of which are interesting to venture capitalists. Another thing that's been around, if you've been in the utility world for a long time, that's come back around again, is energy efficiency technologies. What we used to call demand-side management has been repackaged now as virtual peaking capacity and other things like that. Some of the breakthroughs in solid-state physics and solid-state lighting, many of which have come out of the faculty members here at UC Santa Barbara, promise great efficiency gains because of the energy efficiency promise of light-emitting diodes and things like that over incandescent light. We're seeing micro combined heating and power applications coming back. The deployment of advanced power electronics, those that go beyond silicon to the wide bandgap semiconductors, silicon carbide, gallium nitride, those promise great energy efficiencies as well. And the other big area right now is transportation-related technology opportunities. We talked, there's the supply side and the demand side. The supply side is primarily the fuels. Again, the biofuels, hydrogen, advanced oil recovery, there are activities in all of those areas. And then a lot on the demand side, and much of it surrounding the family of hybrid electrics and plug-in hybrid vehicles. They're exciting to people like us because as they reach bigger and bigger market acceptance, greater market acceptance, they drive a lot of technologies. There's the drivetrain itself, there's advanced battery technologies, advanced power electronics, more efficient motors. All of those are venturable investments and things that we all find exciting. So it was fascinating for me that all of these were talked about today and all of the various pros and cons to one degree or another, and they're all areas in which the venture community's gotten very active.
Thank you. Before opening this up to a general discussion, I'd like to mention a few topics which, at least today, which I consider very significant in the context of this meeting, and which some of which have been touched on today, but rather lightly. And I would be very happy if perhaps in the discussion there would be a little additional points of view expressed. So let me mention what's on my mind. I think looking around here, and I think I'm probably right, that people from many different places here, but one very large group is certainly very underrepresented, and that's the developing world. I spent a very interesting short visit in Ghana a few months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, and I'll be going back to an all-Africa meeting on energy I think it's in June. So on the one hand, I got an inkling of what, at least in one country, and of course Ghana is a relatively well-developed country in Africa, what the situation looks like there. And I trust I'll learn more about it on my second trip. That's one point I wanted to make. Another point that I want to draw attention to, because perhaps we didn't emphasize it as much as we might have, and that is conservation. Particularly in North America, I mean, that is a huge issue because we are so bad at it. And that, if you look at that at the Verso side of this, that means there's a lot of opportunity there. You could compare energy consumption, well, if you want to get a really large number, between, let's say, the United States, of course, per capita consumption, the highest in the world, with, well, let's say with the average in the developing world. We heard some figures here, and they're shocking, and I think we should pay attention to that in some way. But if we compare it with highly developed countries in Europe, it's also shocking. We had a wonderful presentation here at the very end that gave us an example of one very highly developed country in Scandinavia, and somebody who's lived there actually and likes that part of the world very much. I can say that people live just as well there as they do here, at least. And I think the energy cost is what, 1/2, roughly. So conservation, please keep it in mind during this conference, and do keep it in mind after you leave the conference. Carbon capture was mentioned very often, but I didn't hear anybody give a figure of what people think it might cost. I mean, I've seen it very often when what has been very properly stated at this meeting is that the United States is blessed with a lot of coal, and it's almost inconceivable that it will not be used. So carbon capture is going to be an issue here, and we need to, and thank you, what does he call himself? Former want-to-be president, Al Gore, for finally, right, we've come around. Yes, global warming is a reality. And that means, and people now really also, I noticed this at this conference, when people talked about coal, they always said, you know, carbon has to be captured. I like, there's a very nice word that you also hear, which I like better, it's longer, sequester. But it's the same thing. Yes, what does that do to the cost of coal? And I think we should consider the cost of coal, the cost with carbon capture. And yeah, I think those are a few of the things that I invite you, if you feel like it, to comment on, as well as other papers, particularly in the last session. And if you have a pet subject and want to be very brief about it, that's okay too. All right, it's open for questions, and
I have an answer, for, at least from Canada, where we've been working on. My colleague David Keith and I have been working on trying to have we can't call it a tax, so we'll call it a charge on oil sands development. It looks like the number is somewhere around $35 a ton, $5 to $6 a produced barrel in terms of the carbon capture that we know of today. The real question for us is how to account for the risk of storing it, and it's that the probability of escapes changes that cost figure quite dramatically. But just for a nominal number today, assuming that we could inject into current oil fields or maybe later into deep geothermal wells, somewhere around $35 a ton and $5 to $6 a barrel.
okay, and as a percentage figure?
So you're going up by 14, 15%.
14, 15.
Could I ask a question on that? The $35 a ton, are you considering any value for the carbon dioxide you're putting in enhanced oil recovery?
No, I'm assuming that in fact that'll offset it at the end. That's just for our cost of capture.
Okay, see if I understand that.
You say some of that will be.
So I'm going to assume that you'll offset it later.
Okay.
I think my question is for Chuck McDermott. It little follows on what Walter was saying about carbon sequestration indirectly. One reads that there are a very large number of coal plants that are in the pipeline in this country that are awaiting approval. However, under current regulations, either gasification or sequestration, I don't believe is required of those plants. They just need to meet the so-called ambient air standards.
Right.
So without very rapid regulation for sequestration and, say, associated gasification, aren't we likely to see many new coal plants being built in this country which can last 50, 60 years in the near future?
You could. As you point out, the existing air standards require a performance level for, let's say, NOx, SOx, particulates, to be similar to that of an advanced natural gas plant. The wild card is CO2. Some of us in this room have been working around the the politics of climate change and CO2 capture in a regulatory environment that might somehow deal with that for at least a decade, and it proves it's not an instant gratification exercise. Although I think, and now I'm kind of prognosticating on the political side, but I think there's been an unbelievable change in the last 12 months in terms of climate politics in the United States. It's almost an inevitability, I'm told by people who work there, that the Senate will pass climate legislation in this Congress, meaning in the next 2 years. It will not probably become law. The House will probably not pass a bill close enough to confer and create a unified bill, and the president might not sign it. But it's highly likely that after the 2008 elections that we will see some sort of federal climate regulation. And will it be cap and trade, or will it be something a little less rigorous than that is unknown. But for that to be considered an inevitability, if you've been dealing with climate politics in Washington, is pretty astounding. Now, there are other things going on, though, that might slow down the proliferation of those coal plants. For instance, some of the major environmental groups like NRDC and Environmental Defense are putting pressure on the large banks not to finance coal power plants. And that pressure is beginning to take an effect. I think Bank of America has already come forward and said they will hold to a very high standard the financing of any coal-fired power plants. There are other opportunities for citizens to intervene and slow these things down. But your fundamental point is correct. I mean, if a plant gets built, it will operate for 50 years, and there are certainly no federal laws that make you reach some kind of a standard on carbon.
I don't think all those plants.
I'd like to add something here. I heard from a colleague who follows this legislation, California legislation in this area, that in fact the state of California has just passed, the governor has...
Isn't it low carbon fuels?
Well, there's another. I think you're getting to the emissions standard that it's SB 1368 was passed last year. That says...
No, I'm speaking about something that's happening maybe while we are meeting here, and it has to do with licensing, or not licensing, new carbon-fueled power plants in California.
That's what I'm referring to.
Oh, yes. Okay.
There's an emissions performance standard that says none of the utilities in California can make a long-term commitment to anything that emits more CO2 than an efficient combined cycle natural gas plant. And most carbon plants emit about twice as much as that. So they would have to go through capture and storage in order to qualify. As to the other point earlier about the number of new plants that have been announced, I don't think they're going to all come to pass for the reasons that Chuck mentioned. Also, the investors in these companies are stepping up and saying, we don't want to take that future risk. The most egregious case is TXU. They proposed 11 new plants in Texas. And I am assuming it's under the thought that they get grandfathered in once they get these things started. But their own regulators and their investors have stepped up and said, no, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think you'll see a far fewer number of those come to pass than have been announced.
Yes.
There's, as you say, there's a lot of positive wind blowing in the right direction in our legislature and both the U.S. and some of the states right now. But my question is this really sort of a breath of everybody piling onto this, and yet the power of the legislation that they might enact is not really potentially aggressive enough because there is a noise in the system about the potential economic impact that ranges from an Armageddon to a positive impact on our economy, which is floating around. So wondering, until the financial forces such as investment banks, insurance companies, and so forth are in agreement as to and some government agencies in agreement what the real economic impact is likely to be of such things as a carbon surcharge, if you don't like the word tax, what these will be, do you think they really will get together and pass any significant legislation?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at that. They may pass the legislation during this administration because they'll get something in place that won't be as tough as will be during the next administration. So there's pluses and minuses with that. But it gets back to the point that I mentioned earlier, though. It is a future risk, and almost everybody recognizes it's a future risk. And so if you're going to make a major investment in something that's going to have a 30-year life to it, and there's a very good chance in the next 5 years there's going to be a major regulation change, it's a very risky investment. So I think the banks and the others are going to have a hard time in supporting that. So you'll see a combination of regulation and prudent fiscal policy getting involved with this.
I'd like to make a remark to your question also, or at least part of your question, that was that maybe, when the dust has settled, it will be very little, it won't amount to much, or will it amount to much? Well, California, as probably many people in this room know, and we Californians are really proud of that, is really in the last few years particularly, very much in the forefront. And it's substantial what they're doing. They again, just happened in January that there is a new reimbursement schedule that has been enacted in the governor's office. Are you aware of that? And is in very close analogy to what although the figures are different, but they're very substantial, to what the Japanese did about 15 or 20 years ago. Namely, they started subsidizing solar energy, residential solar energy, at a level of about, I think, 75%, with an annual reduction of the subsidy for people who did it the following year or the year after that, 5% per year. So that by now, this started more than 15 years ago, and the subsidies are gone. And it's quite interesting how the public has been mentioned by several people, particularly by Professor Moore, as an important actor in this entire context. During this time, while the subsidies went down for complicated societal reasons, the rate of installation continued to increase, and increased even after the subsidies completely stopped. I think that was probably a significant incentive for California to follow a similar scheme. Very substantial.
Over here. I'd like to just kind of take it a step further and see if you know if there's been any studies, either by the NRDC or some other group, that as we're looking at the economic feasibility of all these technologies, particularly those still based on fossil fuels, if there's been any studies to really calculate the potential externality costs of climate change, not just dealing with the carbon, but looking at the displacement of people because of the rising of seawaters and everything. I mean, we're just looking in such a narrow field here. I'm wondering if there's been studies to try to put price tags on the overall cost of keeping investing in the fossil fuel industries.
I mean, I don't know the exact answer. I would bet that there have been. There are probably people in the room who know.
Yeah, I was going to say, it just came out a month ago.
Glad I could help.
Yes, John.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments, Walter, about the developing world, following up on what you said. As you know, I'm a member of the Academy of Science for the Developing World, and which meets annually in different places. I was at the meeting in October in Brazil, and it's very interesting to hear the discussions. Obviously, these are scientists, and they're very interested in the sort of global energy challenges and climate change and so on. There's a very strong feeling in the developing world that the developed world already owes it a massive debt. basically for screwing things up. And, it was mentioned earlier about the possibility of these CO2 credits and the developing world saying, well, hey guys, you've already had yours and more. But there is a very strong sense that in parts of the world where the climate is changing, people are losing their livelihoods because they can no longer farm, because the rain patterns change. Places that are likely to be affected by flooding, such as Bangladesh and so on. These are going to be massive issues, I think, in the coming years. Having said all that, the other remarkable thing really is that they do recognize that they can't develop their economies in the way that the developed world has. So it was mentioned earlier, on a scale where the USA consumes, say, 10 units of energy per capita, Western Europe's 5, and places like India are 0.1, that's 100 times less. And though we talk about what we're going to do, China and India and Brazil are going to grow and it's going to cause all sorts of problems for us, they are on the high moral ground because their consumption is absolutely minuscule right now compared with ours.
On the consumption, you might be interested to know this. In the United States, per person, about 27 barrels of oil are used per year. And if you go to Japan, it's 17. If you go to South Korea, it's 17. And you go to India with 1.1, it's about 12. And if you go to China, it's less than 1 barrel per person. And China is doing everything it can to get oil sources.
Yeah.
They are literally traveling the world and doing deals with anybody in any country, no matter who, to get their oils.
I mean, it will be an inexorable trend, obviously, because they're growing so rapidly. But the other thing I wanted to say about the developing world is that they're also contributing to some of the solutions as well. And so I think it's remarkable what's happened in Brazil, where the massive development of biofuels while the rest of the world has stood still has been quite remarkable and a good model for the other countries to follow.
So our time is nominally up, but let's have, if there are, 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, please.
I wanted to, I know, I'm very compelled, I think, this issue of the overlapping between electric technologies and transportation that's going to be ongoing, and whether it's fuel cells or whether it's electric cars or something in between, I think is an open question. But the thing that occurs to me is that electric utilities really have a central place in this. Obviously, there's the existing infrastructure, and sort of no matter where we go along those lines, if it gets converted into electricity at some point along the chain, it's got to go through the utility. Now, I would imagine there's a very compelling business case for developing a strategy and sort of a long-term vision for this move towards electric technologies in transportation. And I have some ideas about what that might be, but this question is directed at Mr. LaFlash. I'd like to have a better sense of sort of how the utility, PG&E in particular, I know you're different from some other utilities around, but what's your sort of feeling about where the utilities are going to go with this and where the strategic places that new technology development needs to happen? For example, the smart grid, advanced metering, that sort of thing. Sort of in general terms, the sort of visioning for this, where we're going with this with respect to the electric utilities.
That's almost a set-up question. I just have an interview that came out in Business 2.0 last week with that very same theme in it, about where we're going with the smart grid and how all these pieces fit together. And that's why I mentioned the case about the hydrogen vehicles versus the plug-in hybrids. We're looking at both of them because we're a gas and electric utility, and we have also a compressed natural gas fleet. But the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and eventually the pure battery electric vehicles are very interesting to us. We see where they can do some very beneficial things in our system. One of the things in California is we're adding more renewables every year. And unless it's solar, everything we add on renewables brings in more off-peak nighttime power than we need. That's especially true with wind, for example. So bringing in these vehicles that you're going to charge overnight with extremely clean power and then use them during the daytime to offset much dirtier petroleum and take care of your security issues and other things are a very important concept, and we're very much behind that. We're doing work with a consortium called Plug-in Partners and a number of other agencies on trying to advance that, and we've had discussions with a number of the vehicle manufacturers and battery manufacturers. And I think Chuck made mention of the low carbon fuel standard that came out from the governor's office a couple weeks ago. He's even recognized in that the low carbon fuel standard requires fuel suppliers to reduce their carbon intensity by, I think it's 10% by 2020. And he's even recognized that to the extent you can get electric vehicles in the system, they should create a credit then that could be traded for that reduction, because that is a reduction of the carbon standard. Even if it was, fueled by natural gas-fired power plants, it's much cleaner than petroleum is. And so California is the place where this is going to start, because California has a much cleaner grid than most of the other states. But you're right, it's a very important strategy, and we see it benefits from all directions. Ultimately, I think there was a mention by one of the others earlier, ultimately there'll be the potential even for using as distributed storage to put it back onto the grid during certain times of the day.
Okay, thank you very much, and I think we are going over. You have an answer? Thank you.
This may be a very stupid question, but we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about with the people from ABB, ASEA Brown Boveri, about distribution nets. And if I look at the US and I look at Europe, say from the northern Africa deserts to the Gobi Desert, it's about 7-8 hours time difference. So if you have a net that goes east to west that covers 8-9 hours, you really buffer the from night to day. US has 3 hours from east to west. Is that changing the thinking about solar energy? Because in this discussion, the people from the ABB, and I think they know what they are talking about, are saying that exploiting solar energy from Sahara, Northern Africa, is not the cost of the solar cells, it's the cost of the distribution net. I would like to hear the venture capitalists, if you have some thoughts about this.
Well, I think in the U.S., one of the advantages of solar as we know it today is that it's a distributed resource. I mean, most of it is rooftop solar. Now, we are seeing the development of some bigger utility scale programs, especially here in the Southwest. But given the fact that it is consumed where it is generated, that in a lot of ways is seen as one of the great advantages of the technology. Now, there are technologies that are coming up. For instance, again, this whole issue of concentrating solar technologies and the track that that generate more kilowatt hours in a day per kilowatt of installed capacity. That gets even greater efficiency out of the system as well. But we look at it in our shop primarily for our own investing purposes as a distributed resource and a focus on the rooftop.
So a remark from a physicist, but it will not be news to you. Of course, if Alan Eager spoke about a dream and reality, well, there's been a dream around for many, many years now that one could use these so-called high-temperature superconductors to make transmission lines in an economic way. I mean, one can make them, but it's totally uneconomic at the moment. That, of course, would change the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll go over.